Um, Thank you all for joining. This is going to be a survey type of a lecture. So those of you who thought I was just going to do Eliezer ben Yehuda and modern Hebrew, you're in for what might be a treat, or you might be yawning at the end of the lecture and saying, oh my God, why did he do all this? But I'm going to try and have you understand something called the more things change, the more they stay the same. And the theme is the Bible, the Torah, the Chumash, the Tanakh, any way you want to think of the Bible. That's the foundation of Hebrew. But as is my want, I will try to get you to understand how, in fact, the Bible never uses the word Hebrew. The language, the only language word used in the Bible for Jewish is Yehudit. The Jews of Judea spoke Judean. The word was not Ivrit, it was Yehudit. And that word Ivrit didn't show up until the 2nd century BCE, when in the prologue to a book of Ben Sira's, he uses the word Ivrit. And he writes his book not in Israel or Judea, but in Alexandria, sometime between 175 and 180, or 180 and 175. But in the Chumash, in the Torah, the word Hebrew does not exist as a language, and the only word that describes the language that the Jews spoke was Judean or Judahite or Yehudit. You should also know, and here I feel a little bit like Darwin felt when he did the theory of evolution, that nearly 2% of the words in our Tanakh are not Hebrew words. They are Egyptian words, Greek words, Hittite words, Urian words, Old Indic words, and Old Iranian words. And in fact, the geographic distribution of the stories in the Tanakh reveal that the language was influenced very much by where we were. So that the entire Joseph cycle, which is Genesis probably 37 to 50, is filled with old Egyptian words. The story of Joseph happened in Egypt. So, Pharaoh, Chotam, Suf, Ra, the Egyptian god or goddess, all Egyptian words, and they're all found in the stories of Joseph. Old Iranian words are found in the much later books of the Tanakh, so that in the story of Esther, the story of Daniel, and the story of Ezra, it's a lot of Old Iranian words in the Chumash that you're reading, or in the Tanakh that you're reading, not the Chumash. And as Hebrew evolved, it also reflected the geographic distribution of the Jews throughout the world. So as Hebrew evolved, the influence of Arabic, Italian, German, Russian, Yiddish, and English was part of the development of the language. However, the language really had a strong foundation of the Bible. But I'm going to ask you a question now. And the question is the entire Tanakh written solely in Hebrew? Just speak up if you have an answer.
I'm guessing it's some of it is Aramaic, right?
Good guess. Good guess. Anybody want to expand on that? A portion of Ezra, a large portion of Ezra, is in Aramaic. And Aramaic was learned where? What country was Aramaic?
Iraq?
It has something to do with the Talmud.
Iraq?
Well,
Say
yes, but what was Iraq called back then
Persian.
when the dinosaurs were walking the earth?
Babylonia.
Babylonia. Right, right. So Aramaic makes its way into the Tanakh, and obviously it made its way into our prayer service. So each section of a Siddur, each liturgical section of a Siddur is interrupted by what? What prayer separates
The Kaddish.
the Kaddish? And the Kaddish is said in what language?
Aramaic.
Right.
Is Romano?
Okay, now, after Hebrew and Aramaic, the third and most crucial language that actually helped us to understand a whole lot of Hebrew was Greek. Well, we're going to talk about Hebrew. And if you try to do a timeline, the timeline might be Hebrew to Aramaic to Greek. The Hebrew was preserved after the exile by something called Rabbinic Hebrew. And I'm going to ask Chuck to talk a little bit about that. If you could unmute your mic, Chuck.
I'll take the video off. Can you put the video? No.
You can put on your camera if you want to, but you don't have to.
We're coming. Okay. So, thank you for your patience.
No problem. Savlanut.
Yeah. Go. And,
Talk again so I can see what.
okay, yeah, we're
There you are.
okay. Except it's not quite working. Hi, everybody. So, Rabbinic Hebrew is not a language like French, where you have French people in a country speaking French, which changes over centuries. What you're really looking at is what happened to the Hebrew of the Hebrew scriptures. So let's say around 450, you have the last books of the, no, maybe 400 BCE. You have the last books of what will become the Hebrew scriptures. And then you have about 1,000 years until about the year 600 when the Talmud is finished. And the question is, what happens in that 1,000 years to the Hebrew language? Because as Jerry has pointed out, Jews were not speaking Hebrew. We're pretty sure. We're not quite sure what they were speaking, but we're pretty sure it wasn't Hebrew from the time they come back from Babylonia back to Eretz Israel. They're speaking Greek and they're speaking Aramaic. And there's a line which pretty much goes through Eretz Israel. If you're east of that line, it's Aramaic coming in from Syria and Babylonia. West of the line, it's Greek, but it's all together. And we know this because of inscriptions, coins, the whole area to the east and the west, they're in Greek and they're in Aramaic, all different civilizations. And the Jews are themselves. And also the languages that the books that we have, the books of the Maccabees, the translations, they're in Greek. That's basically what we have. So the Hebrew that we have is the book of Mishnah, which is edited around the years 100, 200, 300 CE. And it is in very interesting Hebrew, which it's pretty clear that it's trying to go back to the biblical Hebrew. And the question is, why suddenly are they, not suddenly, but why is this important? Because it's a literary language. There are a few changes. My favorite change is that you suddenly have a past tense. In Hebrew scriptures, you don't have a true past tense, which you get used to, but it's still kind of odd. And there are many features of what goes on in the Mishnah, which is very similar to what happens in modern Hebrew. So I have two stories for you. One is about Henrietta Sold, and the second story is about Rabbi Akiva. The story about Henrietta Sold is that there's a wonderful dictionary. Well, I'm assuming most of us know that Henrietta Sold started Hadassah, Giza, and is one of the most important women in Jewish history, much less American Jewish history. And she lived, she was born around, what, 1870, approximately, 1880. She lives into the 1930s, 40s.
She lived into the 40s.
In the 40s. And she's all over the place, but mostly we think of her as the person who started Hadassah. Also, the most important dictionary of the Talmud, translating the Hebrew and the Aramaic of the Talmud into English, is by a rabbi named Jastrow, Marcus Jastrow, who was very important politically in Poland and then in the United States, but became very ill and towards the 1880s, which meant he was at home and can devote himself to this marvelous dictionary of the Talmud. And to get it published, he turned to the daughter of one of his friends in Philadelphia. I think the man's name was Benjamin, first name, Sold. And so Henrietta Sold, who is not credited in the book, I checked the preface this afternoon, is in fact the editor of the dictionary of the Talmudic language, Hebrew and Aramaic, into English. Just one of her many, many virtues. The second story is about Rabbi Akiva. And that is because question is, what's going on with the Hebrew language in the time of the temple, when the temple is destroyed? And one way of looking at this, and I can't say that this is universally accepted, but it's a nice Zionist strain, is that there was a conscious imitation, as Jerry has pointed out, of biblical Hebrew. And so what you have up until the time of the temple's destruction in the year 70, you have a bunch of books which imitate Hebrew books. We have them in Greek. So they could have been in Hebrew originally, they could be translated. But we know them because they're in all different languages. But in Hebrew, the rabbis, after the destruction of the temple, they're going to speak Hebrew, and it's not the language that people are regularly using. And part of it is that it's tied up into the national strain of nationalist strain. That after that you see it in the Bar Kokhba rebellion, for instance, where it was very insistent, Zionists love this, going back to what they thought was traditional biblical situations, the Messiah, of course, and also Hebrew. It didn't last very long. And by the year 300, 350, when there are very few Jews left in Eretz Israel, the center of Jewish life is going to be in Babylonia. The language people spoke there was Aramaic, and that's the language of the Talmud. And so the Talmud itself, as I think most of you know, is if you look at a page of Talmud, you have a section of Mishnah, which is beautiful Hebrew, and then the actual discussion is in Aramaic. And the Palestinian Talmud is exactly the same way. And you have this down through about the year 600 when the Muslims take over, and you have this curtain that just draws on whatever happened to Jews. We just don't know from 600 to 800. And up until that time, there's no rabbinic Judaism. There's no, there are rabbis, there's the Talmud, but the Jews doing all sorts of other things. And when the curtain goes back up around the year 900, 950, suddenly everybody is a rabbi, and everybody is using Hebrew as the language of the holy part, but they use their own local languages for how they actually taught. Rashi being a good example. That's it, the rabbinic period.
So we think of Hebrew as a liturgical language, and it was really after the Bar Kokhba revolt that Hebrew began to disappear. But with the return from Babylonia, the Jews in the Galilee, the Jews in Samaria, the Jews in Babylonia spoke Aramaic. The Judean Jews still spoke Hebrew, and for sure the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Sophrim, the scribes, the zealots, the Kohanim, they all tried to maintain Hebrew as their language and as the language of the temple, and therefore the language of liturgy. The idea that Hebrew died is not entirely true, but it was perpetuated almost for 2 or 3 centuries by religious poetry called piyutim. And this was both rhymed and unrhymed Hebrew. And then we see this flowering of Spanish, Sephardic Hebrew in the Middle Ages. We see Ashkenazic Hebrew coming up. We see a flourishing of Hebrew in the East. And then we see modern Hebrew in the Haskalah in the late 19th century. And then we get to Uri ben Svi, Eliezer ben Yehuda, and poetry. Hebrew, in my mind, never died as a literary language and was kind of asleep as a spoken language. But there were many other languages, and when we get to talking about things in the Yeshuv in modern Israel or in Palestine, Israel, we're going to talk about the arguments of language. But language was something that people were very passionate about. And the fact that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Kohanim, the Sophrim, the Zealots, all insisted on Hebrew is a key reason why all of our worship service is in Hebrew, with the exception of marking off the sections of the service, which are in Aramaic. There's a thought that the Am Haaretz, the regular people who showed up in these small synagogues scattered around Eretz Yisrael and were hearing the people who had left Jerusalem and were reenacting a service in a temple and were hearing it in Hebrew, they weren't getting it. So they inserted Aramaic sections so that the average Jew in the Galil who spoke Aramaic could participate in the service, or at least mark off where the transition is from one section of the service to another. Now, Chuck talked about Greek. I think Greek is the reason that we know what Hebrew says. The Torah was translated into Greek. The Jews in Greece, in Alexandria, and everything, as Chuck said, to the west of Palestine, were speaking Greek. And we know what the Greek words mean. So when we have to figure out what the Hebrew words meant, we relied on the Septuagint. We relied on the Greek translation of our Torah, of our Chumash actually, in order to understand what was written. And that's very important. I want to talk to you a little bit about, and we're going to do this twice, about translating words. So let me find, here we go, this one. Okay. Ezekiel. This is where the word chashmal appears. Does everybody know what the word chashmal means in modern Hebrew? Somebody out there knows. Speak up.
The
It
other
means
Jerry knows.
Jerry? What does it mean?
Electricity.
Electricity. Thank you. But the word was used here to describe the fire, the appearance of some sort of a fiery thing around. And they use the word in English, electrum. The Greek translation of chashmal was electron. So when it came time to invent a modern Hebrew word for electricity, we went with chashmal. And it appears twice in Ezekiel, in book 1 and in book 8. Now, Hebrew wasn't obviously the only language that had to invent new words for new things. In Arabic, they use the word for amber to form their word for electricity. And if anybody's a little bit of a geologist, they'll know that amber has inherent static electricity. When you rub your hands around a piece of amber, you'll feel electricity coming out of that stone. So we used chashmal, and they used the word for amber to make the modern Arabic word for electricity. Now I have to figure out how to stop this sharing. Okay. I'm going to jump ahead and talk about the Torah as a holy language, and then try and show you that it wasn't always so holy, and that it was nevertheless the foundation for Hebrew. When the Arab poets started to write poetry, they paraphrased the Quran. And in the flourishing of Hebrew poetics and literature in the Middle Ages, the Jews, the Jewish poets, did the same thing. They did the same thing. But as you will see in the next, where'd it go? In the next page here, Yehuda al-Harizi, who was born in Toledo and died in Aleppo, wrote a rhymed prose, which was not quite a poem, but it was a prose form, but the ends of each sentence rhymed with the previous one. And I'm not giving you the Hebrew because you would not be able to follow it. Take my word for it. It's very interestingly poetic little makama. But I want you to read here. He took from Song of Songs, lead me, we will follow you eagerly. From Genesis, he got away from her and fled outside. You know what story that is, right? Potiphar, and Joseph running away from Potiphar. From Proverbs, do not toil to acquire wealth. When your eyes light upon it, it is gone. From Judges, and this is interesting, a wealth of dyed embroideries for the victor's necks. From Genesis, again, the camp where they met up, a place called Machanaim, 2 companies. From Deuteronomy, the story of a virgin being raped by a man. That should be him, not him. And another line that the girl cried for help and nobody was there to help her. From 1 Samuel, why do you weep? From Genesis, the Potiphar story again, the Hebrew slave came to dally with me. From the Song of Songs, my lover is for me a bag of myrrh as he lies on my breast. And by the way, when Alter wrote and recently published his translation of the Bible, he didn't like bag of myrrh, so he used the word sachet. Translation is a whole another story we'll touch on. And the last one from Numbers, he will not rest till he devours his prey and drinks the blood of the slain. So these are all excerpts from the Chumash. Does everybody understand that? Hazari writes a little makamah that I've titled The Exploits of a Flea. So you have to remember that he's using all of these biblical Hebrew phrases to write this little story of a flea on the body of a woman. And should you say, I will follow him eagerly, he gets away and flees outside. Even if you catch him once or twice, he slips out of your hands, suddenly grows wings and soars like an eagle toward heaven. Often he hides by the maidens beneath their embroidered cloth, going from their loins to their thighs. He conceals himself between their breasts and calls that place the 2 companies, the 2 breasts, the 2 Machanaim. When he chances upon a virgin who is not betrothed or upon a married woman, he clings to her and lies with her until his misdeeds make her scream. And though the maiden cries for help, no one comes to save her. And should you ask her, why do you weep? Why do you clamor? She replies, the pitch black slave came to dally with me. You realize the pitch black slave is the flea. This poet is writing a poem about a woman plagued with a flea. And bedded in my bosom, my lover is for me a bag of myrrh as he lies on my breast. All night long, he fans the flames of battle, as in all night long, this flea is biting this woman, and will not rest till he devours his prey, that's the woman, and drinks the blood of the slain, bites her and drinks. So here's a humorous, funny poem about a flea, and the poet used all biblical words to write the poem. For us, we can't realize what he was actually doing, but he was working for a wealthy Jew, and he was writing a humorous little ditty for this wealthy Jew to read, and he was relying entirely on biblical Hebrew. Okay, now, we're going to jump. We're going to jump from the Middle Ages in Spain to the Haskalah, which is the late 19th century, the Enlightenment, and the center of Jewish enlightenment was Odessa. You all know where Odessa is? on the Black Sea, right? It was the heart of the beginning of modern Hebrew literature. The heart of the beginning of modern Hebrew literature. And the writers wrote in two styles. So when Abraham Mapu, who was the first modern Hebrew novelist, wrote The Love of Zion, he wrote it entirely in archaic biblical Hebrew. But when he wrote a contemporary social satire called The Hypocrite, he apologized to his readers and said, "I'm sorry, but I'm using the Hebrew of the black and comely Babylonian maiden." He was using rabbinic Hebrew to write his social satire. So he wrote his first novel in archaic biblical Hebrew and his second novel in rabbinic Hebrew. Now, 1890 Odessa was the center of Hebrew letters. But by 1920, the center moved to Palestine. And here you get the beginning of the separation that some of you who are older might know between Ashkenazic Hebrew and Sephardic Hebrew. Now remember, from Odessa until the 1920s or 30s, all of Hebrew poetry and all of Hebrew literature was written and read with an Ashkenazic accent. But when modern Hebrew developed in Israel, the speakers chose a Sephardic accent. The Sephardic accent that they chose because they were following the melodic notes of how to chant the Torah. And if you follow the melodic notes of how to chant the Torah, you will hear that the emphasis is on the last syllable of the word. But in Ashkenazic Hebrew, the emphasis is on the penultimate syllable, the syllable just before the last syllable. So Bialik, writing in Odessa, but then coming to Israel and making Aliyah, could write a line of a poem, and he wrote this line, "Our house cat still daydreaming," right? That's the line. In Ashkenazic Hebrew, "Chasul beisenu oidea hoize." That's Ashkenazic Hebrew. And it's got a flow to it. In Sephardic Hebrew, the same words come out, "Chatul beitenu odo chozeh." Completely different issues. And it was a struggle. So Uri Tzvi Greenberg and others would write poetry using Ashkenazic sounding words in their head. But if they actually included something that was being said by someone living and working in Palestine, that they would write in Sephardic Hebrew. There was a fight, and there was a nationalistic drive for Hebrew to become modern. And let me tell you the fight first by asking some questions. What language was the first Zionist Congress conducted in? Anybody know? The first Zionist Congress.
German.
German.
German, yeah,
German.
in German. The Basel Statement was written in German. So there were those who advocated that German should be the language of Israel. Second language.
So Jerry,
Yes,
can I just say something?
please.
I just want to say that my grandfather was a delegate to that,
Yeah,
to that.
how cool is that?
To the
Basel
Fourth Zionist
Conference.
Congress?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Well, we're gonna get some interesting names in here in a minute, I hope, as soon as I can find my notes again. Yeah. So the second language that was advocated to be the national language of the Jewish people was the language spoken by most Jews in Eastern Europe, and that language was
Yiddish.
bingo. The third language that was advocated was,
Was it German?
we have German, we have Yiddish, Arabic was the third language.
That's strange.
It's not that strange. There are a lot of Jews from Arab lands living in Palestine. And the fourth language, which blew my mind, but then when I investigated a little bit, and this is how I was going to tie it into kibbutz, the fourth language that was proposed and got just a little bit of traction was Esperanto.
Oh.
Does anybody know what Esperanto is?
Yes.
It's the Spanish equivalent of Yiddish.
No,
No,
that's
No, no,
Ladino. That's
Oh, that's the
Ladino.
international
Oh, and
language.
by the way, some people wanted Ladino to be.
Yeah.
Right, now that's the international
Very
language.
much. Helen, tell us what Esperanto is.
Me?
Yeah,
Esperanto is a synthetic, man-made language that was basically invented or created by, I don't remember the name, sometime in the middle of last century.
no, he did it. He did it in 1887, and
Yeah.
he who did it was Zamenhof, who was
Zamenhof.
actually a Jewish ophthalmologist.
Yeah, and that has a street named on him in Tel Aviv.
Yes, Mapu has a street. Yehuda Leib Gordon, Yalag has a street. Aleph Daled Gordon has a street. It's wonderful when you go to Israel. Some of you that have walked around Tel Aviv with me, all these streets are named after writers and poets. It's just wonderful. Anyhow, he was a Jewish ophthalmologist, and he advocated for Esperanto, and it was taken up a little bit by some of the people on the kibbutz because it was another utopian idea that if we all spoke one language, Esperanto, which, by the way, means hope, we would all live in peace. The sad part of that is that, well, the interesting thing is Zamenhof was his last name. I believe that's the last name of Kamala Harris's husband. I'll let that lie there. His daughter, Lydia, converted to the Baha'i faith, which was also a faith that claimed to try and be universal in its appeal, but she died in Treblinka.
Mm.
And her two sisters also died in the Shoah. So the Zamenhof family, who invented Esperanto and tried to have it be the language of Israel and had some kibbutzniks that were advocating for it were wiped out in Europe.
Jerry, can
yeah.
I interrupt real quick? The one name, it's Ella. The one name that I'm missing in all this is Ben Yehuda, and he's.
I'm getting to it. I'm getting to it.
Sorry. Thank you.
Give me time.
Sablenut.
Give me time. Give me time. So, you show up in and you read a paper. You read a Hebrew paper. And you're a really good linguist. And you've studied lots of languages. And you were born in 1858 and you grew up in Belarus. And like any other Jewish kid, you started by learning Chumash. At the age of 3, he went into a cheder, and then he learned biblical Hebrew. And by the time he was 12, Eliezer ben Yehuda knew Torah, knew Mishnah, and knew Talmud. His parents wanted him to become a rabbi and send him to yeshiva, but it didn't quite take. The religion did not take with him. And he was a good linguist, and he learned French, he learned German, and he learned Russian. And then he went up to Latvia and studied even more. And then he was reading a Hebrew newspaper. The newspaper was called Hashachar, and he got it in his head that reviving the Hebrew language was important, and like Esperanto, but for Ben Yehuda, it was Hebrew that would unite all the Jews around the world. So part of his drive to invent a modern spoken Hebrew was to unite all the Jews around the world. He realized that he could not do that. He actually wrote this without restoring the land. He wrote, the Hebrew language can only live if we revive the nation and return it to the fatherland. So in 1881, he made Aliyah. And then he made a rule that only Hebrew would be spoken in his home. And there's a story, well, there's a lot of stories, I'll tell you two. One story is that he chastised his wife for singing Russian lullabies to their son, Ben Sion Ben Yehuda. So she's putting her kid to bed. She wants to rock him to bed and sing him a lullaby. She sings him a Russian lullaby that she remembers from her mother, and her husband gives her hell. So no language but Hebrew in this house. So Ben Sion Ben Yehuda considered the first native-born Hebrew speaker. He was born in Palestine into a home where only Hebrew was spoken. You must realize now, because I tried to show you, that Hebrew never quite died as a language. It continued as a literary language, but it never quite died as a language. Eliezer ben Yehuda was trying to make it a vernacular again. So here we have Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language, and then we have Eliezer ben Yehuda's diary, where he writes down, clearly excited and happy, I think I have succeeded. Hebrew will again be a living language because I heard children cursing in Hebrew in the streets. So that was his, joy, was he heard little kids cursing and he knew he had captured them or they had captured Hebrew. But he was trying to do vernacular Hebrew. Literary Hebrew had continued. And Aaron Meged, an Israeli novelist, sort of wrote something very nice about the revival of Hebrew. This is what he wrote. The revival of the Hebrew language is not like Lazarus arising miraculously from the dead. It is more like the sleeping beauty awakened by the prince. She was not dead. She had only been dormant for a long time. And she was not rotten bones, but a real beauty. Now, when you betroth her and bring her into your house, your problem is how to make this noble, aristocratic princess, biblical and rabbinic Hebrew, that's my insert, adorned with jewels and clad in purple, do all the domestic work, soil her hands, break her back cooking, washing and tending the garden in the backyard. Contrary to Eliza Doolittle of Pygmalion, she is quite all right at fancy parties, right? Academic Hebrew, liturgical Hebrew, but she misbehaves in the marketplace. And the marketplace was Palestine, where all of a sudden you had to come up with words that never existed in Hebrew. Okay, so Ben Yehuda was practical as well as idealistic, and he realized that he had a gigantic challenge in front of him. But he did not do this all on his own. The people who made Aliyah from 1881 to 1914, the first and second Aliyot, organized Hebrew teachers who tried to establish Hebrew as the language in the school system. And they succeeded. And they pressured Eliezer Ben Yehuda to set up a committee to help reinvent Hebrew. So he established Vad HaLashon, the Committee for the Language, which later became Academia L'Lashon HaIvrit, which already has a Greek word in it, academy, right? And they put together minutes and published the minutes. And in those minutes, over 60,000 words were invented and published.
Amazing.
And to this day, the Hebrew Academy, or the Academy for the Hebrew Language, still exists. And the battle was really not a battle, but a trial. And the trial took place in the newspaper press. And in that newspaper press, there was one newspaper called Davar, which literally means the word. And it was published by the Histadrut. So it was the most widely read paper. So if somebody invented a word in Hebrew and it was used in Davar, that was like the imprimatur, yes, we've accepted that word. If it was used in any of the other small papers, and in those days, all papers were affiliated with political movements, it wasn't considered as accepted until it was used in Davar, which was the most widely read paper, and then it became the word you use. Now, the battle. I told you the battle was to some degree German, the language of the First Zionist Congress, Yiddish, the language of the mass of Jews coming from Eastern Europe, and Hebrew. So the question you could ask yourself is, who won the battle? And here, I declare 3 winners. The first winner, obviously, is Hebrew. Shai Agnon got a Nobel Prize in 1966 in literature for his writing in Hebrew. But the other co-winner of the Nobel Prize in 1966 was Nelly Sachs. What language did she write in? German. And then in 1978, Isaac Bashevis Singer won the Nobel Prize in Literature, and he wrote in Yiddish. So a Jewish Hebrew writer, a Jewish German writer, and a Jewish Yiddish writer all won Nobel Prizes in literature in all 3 languages. Now I'm going to tell you a personal story about the battle between Yiddish and Hebrew. Isaac Bashevis Singer, and by the way, his middle name, Bashevis, is really Batsheva, which was the name of his mother, and he took it as a pen name. Isaac Bashevis Singer left Europe in 1935 and came to America. He left behind a common law wife, Runya Punch, and her son, Yisrael Zamir, singer Zamir. Runya and Yisrael Zamir went to Israel and settled on Kibbutz Beit Alpha. Isaac Bashevis Singer went to New York. Yisrael Zamir became a great fighter in the Haganah and eventually became a shaliach, an emissary to the Zionist youth movement that I belong to, Hashomer Hatzir. And he came to the Bronx, and he was the shaliach to our Bronx Ken. And his father was Isaac Bashevis Singer, living on the Upper West Side. They had such a fight that Israel Zamir would not let his children meet their grandfather. Right? Yiddish versus Hebrew. Until Isaac Bashevis Singer came to our little meeting place, our Ken of Hashomer Hatzir, and gave us a talk. And we heard him speak. And then after that, he showed up at his son's house and saw his grandchildren. But the split between America Yiddish, Israel Hebrew was played out right there in that family. And it was an amazing, amazing split. By the way, Shai Agnon, the person who won the Nobel Prize for writing in Hebrew, his name, and he's related. How many of you know that we have a Tchotchkes family in Norwich? Jerry Schwell, did you know the Tchotchkes family?
Nope.
We have a Tchotchkes family in Norwich. Shai Agnon's name was Shmuel Yosef Halevi Tchotchkes. And next time I give a lecture, you're going to hear about the Barrett's family, which is another New London Jewish family, and their ties to a kibbutz. I wanted to close very quickly with 2 derivations.
Jerry,
To use in Hebrew. So they have to come up with a word for the back axle of a car or a truck. And they come up with the word back axe. That was the word for the back axle of a truck or a car. Then they had to come up with the word for the front axle. You know what they came up with? Front back axe. Now, I want you to
Jerry,
know that
I'm
the,
gonna be rude and interrupt you because the Minion people are waiting. And they
okay, I
cannot
will wrap it up
on.
in 2 minutes. I have till 7:30.
You have one.
Very swell. Can you do your morality and North Star and give a nod to Bruce Levine really quickly?
Of course. We heard a lecture from Bruce at the planetarium about the importance of the North Star. Hebrew word for north is tzafon. The word for compass is matzben. Notice the same root. But more importantly, consider the idea of moral compass, because matzpun, same root, is Hebrew for conscience. So that is where just kind of raises the hairs on the back of my head with awe that those concepts were so fundamental, as I believe and cherish the beauty of that's inherent in all that.
I'll never look at the North Star without thinking
You're
about
not
that.
thinking of that anymore. Okay, thank you very much for
Jerry.
this lecture again.